he didn't read the will. That was the first thing Petra Winslow thought, when the lawyer slid the folder across the conference table. Not toward her husband, not toward the row of suits lined up on his side, but directly in front of her. She watched Preston's jaw tighten. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected any of it, really. That was always his problem. Preston Whitfield assumed the world arranged itself around his preferences, and for 41 years, most of it had. Petra had made sure of that. She had learned early in their marriage that a man like Preston needed to believe he was the architect of everything good in his life. She let him believe it. She signed documents he slid in front of her without explanation, smiled at dinners she hadn't been invited to plan, and wore dresses chosen by his assistant for events where she was expected to be decorative and quiet. She had been very good at being decorative and quiet. What Preston never understood, what he had never bothered to find out, was that Petra Winslow had been decorative and quiet the same way a river is calm on the surface. Most of what she was moved underneath, where no one thought to look. She had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky. Her father, Roy Winslow, had been a man of few words and enormous patience. He worked the same 40 acres his grandfather had cleared, kept detailed records in a green ledger he stored under the floorboard beneath his bed, and told Petra one thing, only once. When she was 11 years old and had come home crying because a boy at school had taken her lunch money. The person who holds the deed holds the ground. Everything else is just noise. She hadn't fully understood it then. She understood it completely now. The conference room was on the 32nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan stretched gray and flat under a November sky. Petra had chosen this firm specifically because it was not the firm Preston used. Every lawyer in this room worked for her. Every document on this table had been prepared at her direction over the course of 14 months. While Preston had been occupied with Constance Albright, 28 years old. Preston's junior marketing director, hired 8 months before Petra had first noticed the signs. She didn't hate Constance. That had surprised her. She had expected to. But hatred requires a kind of surprise, and by the time Petra knew about Constance, she had long since stopped being surprised by anything Preston did. What she felt instead was something colder and more useful: clarity. She had used that clarity well. "Mr. Whitfield," said the lead attorney, a woman named Adelaide Marsh, who had the steady voice of someone who had delivered bad news to powerful men many times before, and had never once apologized for it. "Your attorney is welcome to review the documents, of course. But I should tell you that everything here has been filed, recorded, and in several cases already transferred. This meeting is not a negotiation. It is a notification." Preston looked at Petra. That look, she had seen it 1,000 times. It was the look he used when he expected her to soften something, to smile, to lower the temperature in the room. She had been lowering temperatures for him for 19 years. She kept her hands flat on the table and said nothing. "What do you mean, transferred?" Preston's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Gerald, leaned forward. "You can't transfer marital assets without." "They aren't marital assets," Adelaide said. She opened her copy of the folder to a page near the back. The Winslow Family Trust was established in 1987 by Roy Winslow of Harlan County, Kentucky. It was inherited by his sole heir, Petra Winslow, upon his death in 2009, and has never been commingled with marital property. The trust holds title to 412 acres in Harlan County, 2 commercial properties in Lexington, a warehouse property in Louisville, and the primary residence at 1840 Crestwood Drive, Chicago, Illinois. A silence fell over the room that had a particular quality to it, the kind that comes when powerful men realize they have been operating on a misunderstanding so fundamental it cannot be argued away. "The house," Preston said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. "The house," Adelaide confirmed. Preston turned to Petra again. This time the look was different. The expectation was gone. What replaced it was something she had never seen on his face before, something she might have called fear, if Preston Whitfield had ever seemed like a man capable of being afraid. "You've been living in my house for 19 years, he said. "I've been living in my house," Petra said. It was the first time she had spoken since the meeting began. She kept her voice even. She had practiced being even for a long time. "Your name was never on the deed, Preston. You never asked to see it." You assumed. You've always assumed. He stared at her. She could see him searching for the version of this story in which he was still in control, still the one who held the ground. He couldn't find it. It wasn't there to be found. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Gerald asked questions. Adelaide answered them. Numbers were stated. Records were produced. Preston sat with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated while the architecture of his assumptions was quietly, thoroughly dismantled. Petra had known it would come to this. She had been preparing for it to come to this for 14 months. But the truth was, she had been preparing for something like this for much longer. Since the green ledger, since the floorboard, since her father's voice on a cold morning in Kentucky telling her that the person who holds the deed holds the ground. She had held the ground. It was Preston who had been standing on someone else's land all along. The day Petra had found the evidence, really found it undeniable and in front of her, was a Thursday in September. She had come home early from a gallery opening because she'd had a headache, which was true, and also because something had been pulling at her for weeks, a low hum of wrongness she couldn't name. She'd walked into Preston's home office to find his laptop open, a thread of messages visible on the screen, and she had stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds before she understood what she was reading. She hadn't cried. She remembered being surprised by that, waiting for the tears the way you wait for pain after an injury, bracing for it. But what came instead was that clarity she would later become grateful for. Cold and clean and very, very sharp. She had taken a photograph of the screen with her phone. Then she had closed the laptop, walked to the kitchen, taken 2 Advil, and called her college roommate Harriet, who was a licensed therapist and who said after a long pause, "Okay, first, are you safe? Good. Second, don't do anything yet. Third, call Adelaide Marsh." Harriet had given her Adelaide's number 3 years earlier, after another friend had gone through a divorce and come out the other side intact. At the time, Petra had put the number in her phone under dentist, second opinion, and thought she would never need it. She had called it that Thursday night. Adelaide had asked her a series of careful questions about assets, about what was in her name versus Preston's, about a trust she had mentioned once in passing, the one her father had left her, the one she had continued paying property taxes on for 15 years, without ever thinking of it as leverage, just as something that was hers, something that had always been hers. "Don't move anything," Adelaide told her. "Don't change anything. Go about your life exactly as you have been. I'm going to need 3 months to understand the full picture, and then we're going to make some decisions together. Can you do that?" Yes, Petra said, and she had. She had gone about her life exactly as she had been. She had smiled at dinners, she had worn the dresses. She had stood beside Preston at his company's annual gala in October, shaken hands with Constance Albright, looked the woman in the eye, and said, "It's wonderful to meet you," with a warmth so convincing that Constance had visibly relaxed. That had required a kind of discipline that Petra had not known she possessed. But it turned out that 19 years of being decorative and quiet had trained her for precisely this. Adelaide had needed not 3 months, but 14. There were complexities, a real estate holding in Lexington that had been partially leased to one of Preston's subsidiaries, a question about whether a renovation loan taken out in 2018 had created any marital interest in the Crestwood Drive property. Adelaide unraveled each of them with the meticulous patience of someone who understood that the difference between a clean exit and a devastating one lived in the details. Petra had learned to live in the details too. She had also begun quietly to prepare the house, not to leave it, to keep it. She had hired a contractor to assess deferred maintenance. She had opened a personal checking account at a bank Preston had no relationship with. She had gradually, over the course of a year, moved the small things she cared about. Her mother's jewelry, her father's ledger, a box of photographs, to a storage unit registered in her name. The things she didn't care about she left exactly where they were. Preston didn't leave the house that night. She had expected him to. She had half expected him to go to Constance, to arrive at Constance's apartment in Lincoln Park, with his luggage and his wounded dignity, and make himself the tragic hero of a story in which Petra was the villain. Instead he came home, fixed himself a drink in the kitchen, and stood in the doorway of the living room where Petra was reading, and said, "We should talk." "I think everything relevant was covered this afternoon," Petra said. She did not look up from her book. Petra. His voice was different again. Not the boardroom voice, not the performance voice he used at galas. Something underneath all of that. I didn't know about the house. I genuinely didn't. I know you didn't. She set the book down then. She looked at him. He looked older than he had this morning, and she understood that this was what it looked like when a man's assumptions were removed. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a kind of deflation, like air going out of something. That's the part I need you to understand, Preston. Not that I hid it from you. I didn't hide it. You never asked. In 19 years, you never once asked me about my father's land. You never asked about the trust. You never asked about anything that was mine before you, because you didn't think there was anything. You thought I arrived with nothing. He was quiet. I arrived with everything, she said. You just weren't paying attention. He slept in the guest room that night. She heard him moving around up there. Footsteps, a faucet. The particular silence of a man alone, with something he couldn't think his way out of. She didn't feel sorry for him. She had spent a long time worrying that when this moment came, she would feel sorry for him, and she was grateful to find that she didn't. What she felt was something closer to exhausted relief, the feeling of setting down a weight she had carried so long she'd stopped noticing it was there. She fell asleep before 11. It was the best sleep she'd had in 2 years. The divorce took 9 months from that November meeting to final decree. Gerald fought hard on Preston's behalf, the way expensive attorneys fight when a powerful man is losing something and can't accept the mathematics of it. He challenged the trust documentation. He argued commingling based on the 2018 renovation. He subpoenaed Petra's financial records going back 12 years, apparently hoping to find something. She was never quite sure what. Adelaide responded to each motion with the calm efficiency of someone who had anticipated every move and prepared the counter 3 weeks earlier. The Lexington property matter was the most complicated. Preston's subsidiary had leased commercial space there for 4 years, and Gerald argued this created an equitable interest. The judge, a methodical woman named the Honorable Susan Kraft, disagreed. She ruled that a lease, however long, does not create an ownership interest in the lessor's asset, and that the Winslow family trust had been established, maintained, and documented as a separate property instrument throughout the marriage. Next issue, Judge Kraft said, and moved on. Petra had sat in that courtroom and felt something she hadn't expected. A deep, anchoring pride in her father. Roy Winslow had been gone for 15 years. He had died in the house in Harlan County, in the bed where he was born, without ever once having set foot in a courtroom. But the thing he had built, the green ledger, the careful records, the deed kept in a fireproof box, had walked into that courtroom on his behalf and spoken more clearly than any lawyer. The person who holds the deed holds the ground. She understood now that he had known. He had known that a woman who left Kentucky with nothing but her education and her talent would need something solid under her feet. He had built it for her before she knew she would need it. She thought about that a lot in those 9 months. Constance Albright left Preston's company in February, 6 months before the divorce was final. Petra heard about it from a mutual acquaintance, mentioned in passing over lunch, and received the information with the same neutral expression she gave all information that no longer required her emotional energy. What happened between Preston and Constance after Petra withdrew from the picture was Preston's business in the most literal sense. It had nothing to do with her. What she focused on instead was the Lexington property. One of the commercial spaces in Lexington had been vacant for 8 months by the time the divorce proceedings ended. The tenant had been a small clothing retailer that hadn't survived the past few years of economic pressure. Petra had been in contact with a local real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Deanna who had grown up in the county and knew every business owner within 40 miles, and together they had identified a possible tenant, a regional bakery chain that was expanding, looking for exactly the kind of square footage the space offered. The lease was signed in August, 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Petra drove down to Lexington for the signing. She walked through the empty space beforehand, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, and tried to imagine what her father would have thought of all this. A bakery, of all things, in a building that had once been a farm equipment warehouse his own father had sold to pay a debt. The land had circled back to the family. Families were like that sometimes. She stood in the center of the empty space and let herself feel it, all of it. The grief and the relief and the strange, quiet pride of a woman who had held on to something long enough for it to matter. Then she took a breath and walked toward the door, where Deanna was waiting with the paperwork and a pen. Preston sold his penthouse in the Gold Coast and moved into a condo in River North. Petra heard about this through the same channels that delivered most information she no longer sought out, ambient, unavoidable. She wished him no particular harm. She also wished him nothing in particular good. He was simply a person she had once made a life with, and now she was making a different life without him, and the distance between those two sentences was everything that the past 2 years had been. She kept the house on Crestwood Drive. It was, she told Harriet over dinner one evening in late September, a perfectly good house. It had good light in the mornings. The kitchen had been renovated in 2018, which she could now think about without any of the previous legal anxiety. The garden in the back had gone somewhat wild during the long distraction of the divorce proceedings, and she had spent 3 weekends in October cutting it back and turning the soil and planting bulbs that would not appear until spring. "You know what I keep thinking?" she told Harriet, pushing a piece of bread around the olive oil on her plate. "I keep thinking about how long I was quiet, not just with Preston. In my whole life, I learned to take up very little space. And then this whole thing happened and I realized I wasn't taking up little space. I was just holding it under the surface. Like the trust, like the land. I had so much more than anyone knew, including me." Harriet, who had heard a great many things across a great many dinner tables, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father knew." Petra thought about that for the rest of the evening. She thought about it on the drive home, and while she unlocked the front door of her house, and walked into the entry hall with its good light and its familiar smell of wood, and the faint trace of the garden that seemed to follow her in no matter how carefully she wiped her shoes. She stood there for a moment in the quiet. Roy Winslow had known. He had left her the ground to stand on before she knew she would ever need to stand her ground. He had understood that the world would require it of her eventually. That every woman who moved through the world with her particular mixture of intelligence and restraint would eventually arrive, at a moment that demanded she be more than decorative, more than quiet. He had made sure she had something solid under her when that moment came. Petra set her keys on the entry table. She looked around at the rooms she knew, the rooms she had shared, the rooms that were only hers now, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely like herself. She was home. She had always been home. She just hadn't known until now that the home had always, only, been hers.